Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever you are joining us from, you are incredibly welcome. My name is Hazel Burton and I'll be your driver for today. We're going to be talking about what actually works in security and how do we know that it's working. So what are the most effective ways to do things like gaining executive buy-in, hiring and nurturing the best people, automating your environment on a tight budget, and so much more. And we're going to be drawing on some pretty awesome data to use as our fuel for all of that. So if you haven't already, do check out Cisco's brand new report out today. It's called the 2021 Security Outcomes Study. And today we're going to be picking out the key highlights of that report and discussing how security teams can use it as evidence to make sure your security programs are running at maximum potential. So you can download that report for free at cisco.com/go/security outcomes. And now I want to introduce three people with legendary status who are going to wade with me into the wonderful waters of this data and help us to understand what it all means. First up, one of my favorite people in the world. I learn an incredible amount every time we speak. She's been instrumental in the development of this report. So it's Wendy Nather, Head of Advisory CISOs at Cisco Duo. How are you today, Wendy?
Well, I just possibly can't be any more excited than you are, Hazel. So, I'm kind of left bereft here, but very happy to be here.
Awesome. And secondly, this report is for anyone who works in security, but for CISOs, we believe that there's some great evidence in here that will hopefully be really helpful to you as leaders of your security organization. So we thought it was very prudent to invite our very own CISO, the person ultimately responsible for keeping us all safe online, Mike Hanley. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Hazel, for having me here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. And finally, none of this would be possible without the incredibly clever folks over at Scientia Institute. They have worked hand in hand with us to come up with all the analysis that you're about to hear. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome founding partner of Scientia, Wade Baker. Wade, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Hazel. Thanks again, and literally a dream come true to work with you all. And it's been a long but very fun road. Glad to be at this moment.
Awesome. And are the slippers still on, or did you dust out the fancy sheets today?
I would have to contort myself to show you my feet, but I have real shoes on, so it's a special occasion.
Awesome. Now, just before we get started, for those of you who are joining us live, first of all, you're very welcome. But we would also love to take your questions. So if you're watching us on the cisco.com website, there should be a Q&A panel that you can use to submit your question. If you're watching us on Facebook or LinkedIn, if you just type your question into the comments. And if you're watching us on Twitter, if you just use the hashtag security outcomes in your tweet, we can pick it up. Please don't wait, do that throughout the session. I'll gather them up and we'll answer as many as we possibly can at the end of the show. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you, Wendy, people who follow you on Twitter will know that you've been teasing this report for a while. You're very excited about it. Tell me why.
Well, as a former CISO and a former analyst, one of the big questions that I feel we've never really been able to answer is how do we know what works in security? I mean, we know what people are doing, and we have plenty of benchmarks to explain that, but we don't know if it actually works. So I've always admired the work that Wade and his crew have done and thought, what if we could really dig in with actual data science and do some research into whether there are correlations that we can identify between certain security practices and security outcomes besides not getting hacked. And that's why the main reason why I'm so excited about what we found here, because first of all, there are things we didn't expect. There are things that you would think are incredibly obvious that, but we really would like to dig in and find out why. It's kind of nice to have them confirmed. And then finally, there are things that you would think, yeah, well, Cisco kind of had to say that because, they try to sell things. But I swear, what we did here was a double-blinded study. the respondents didn't know who was asking the questions, and we didn't know who was answering them. And we didn't ask them to tell us what practices correlated with what outcomes. We just asked them about practices, and then we asked them about outcomes separately, and then we looked ourselves to see if there was any correlation that we could identify. So I just want to put that out there to say, no, anything that sounds really convenient, I promise we didn't make this up ourselves.
Brilliant. And Wade, can you tell us about your role within the production of this report and the survey elements themselves? So how we collected all this data and how we analysed it.
Absolutely. So I just, in fact, this morning was writing about how I've been doing security surveys for a long time. I think going back to, I used to do some post-event surveys after like SQL Slammer and Blaster and MyDoom, if that gives you the era and length of time. and I've really never been able to be involved in a study like this one. True fact there. This was 4,800 respondents from all around the world, done with a quota-driven stratified random sample, if that means anything to the survey nerds out there. But we had a target for 400, 200, 150 responses from 25 different countries. We, Scientia, did not field that survey, but Cisco hired a legitimate survey research firm to collect that data. But we had the opportunity to analyze the data that was collected in that. And it was, I don't know what to say, but just really fun from a research standpoint. Again, you rarely have the opportunity to be able to dive down into detail at that level and segment it and slice it along 25 different countries and different industries and all those kinds of things. So it was a great thing to be involved in. And again, like Wendy said, I was very, very interested to try to answer the question of what does actually work in security, and to see probabilities and increases in success and correlations pop out of that analysis was really cool.
Excellent. So Wendy mentioned there are some surprising things in here as well. So I want to maybe focus on a couple of headline pieces. Mike, before we dive into the rest of the data, I'd love to ask you, what is the one outcome, one piece of data that really resonated with yourself, and why is that?
Yeah, for me, Hazel, a lot of this is about simplicity, sustainability, and just evolving our strategy to meet the changing needs of the businesses that as CISOs we're supporting. I mean, certainly inside Cisco, like many of you who are watching, we've dealt with a lot in 2020, the effects of the pandemic, the changing world around us, changing business models, new ways of thinking and working for employees. And to me, a key trend in the survey that I think is important that I'd say, I'd ask a lot of practitioners to think about is, how are you aligning your security strategy and evolving your security strategy in such a way where it contemplates the needs of the business and really kind of meets and accelerates the confidence with which you can, accelerate that transformation that your businesses are undergoing. We'll talk more about this as we go through, but I think that's just a key theme, is focusing on a shared understanding that security contributes to this transformation and figuring out the right, best, and simplest ways to go about that.
Right, absolutely. We do have a chart which we're going to show you a bit later, talking about how you can use this data in a personalized way. You can kind of choose what you want to focus on, and you can create your own journey to get there. So I'm going to tease that now, and we're going to show it later. So Wendy, similar question for you. Where did the data surprise you most? Where did you say, ooh, the loudest?
Well, one of the things that, we found some things that seem to correlate a lot with a lot of the different outcomes. And, the outcomes, as I said, are not just about not getting hacked. They're about minimizing unplanned work. They're about gaining buy-in from your peer organizations, your peer departments, getting cooperation from within your organization, which is always a very tough row to hoe for CISOs. And then there were things that appeared not to correlate at all with any of these outcomes. And one of them that just apparently had no statistically significant correlation was putting somebody in charge of compliance. And yeah, I just want to go womp 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 here because a lot of people do not like compliance. I know some people who do, and they're very nice people. But um, it seems that just putting somebody in charge of compliance by itself is not enough to get you any of the outcomes that you want from your security program, including meeting regulatory compliance obligations. So it makes sense when you unwrap it and think about it that just putting the name in somebody's title is not going to help unless you have a lot of other practices that bring you closer to compliance. But that was one of the ones where we all just kind of looked at that and sat around and laughed a lot when we saw it.
Well, can open, worms everywhere. I just want to remind, so if you've just joined us, we are live and we are going to be taking your questions. So if you're watching us on cisco.com, just pop your question into the Q&A. If you're watching us on social media, just pop your question into the comments or use the hashtag security outcomes. Wade, I'd like to kind of talk about some specific parts of the report, and I want to look at both ends of the scale. So I want to look at the most successful security practices, and I want to look at the ones that are the hardest to implement. So Wade, could you give us an overview of this bit? Let's start with the good news first. Which practices that are being implemented the most successfully? If you maybe talk about the top 2 or 3.
Okay. Yeah, and as I do this, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Ben Edwards, who is on the Scientia team and did a lot of the research on this, and I think just came up with a fantastic way to analyze this data such that the results make sense. I mean, it's just beautiful that you can look at the numbers in this report once you get it, and anytime you see a percentage, it's a direct probability. It's usually talking about the percentage increase in likelihood of achieving a certain outcome, the change in success rate, if you will. And that's, you can read that and start really making some decisions on it. So I enjoyed that aspect. Now, as far as which practices, again, what we're trying to do here is we have 25 common security practices and 11 diverse program level outcomes, the kinds of things that a CISO would want to be tracking against. And we approached this from several different ways. We looked at overall which practices contribute to overall program success. And we also looked individually at each specific outcome and asked that same question, which practices contribute to this specific outcome? And as you might guess, depending on which outcome you're looking at, there's a different set of practices. So I'm just going to start with the overall, and this is one of the first charts you'll come across where we look at overall program success and the top contributors to that. Number 1 is having a proactive tech refresh strategy. Now, when I say that, it might not say, aha, I know exactly what that is. And so there is an appendix in this report where you can look up every single one of these things and see the exact question that was posed to the people taking the survey. But what that's really trying to distinguish is how do you maintain your technology? Do you only fix it when it's broken? Or do you proactively upgrade and seek best of breed, newer, modern technology as part of your infrastructure, right? Those are very different strategies. The one that really works is the latter, that proactive best of breed approach. Second most powerful control overall was a well-integrated technology stack. So right off the top there, you've got 1 and 2 have to do with technology, keeping modern, well-integrated, everything working together. And then number 3 overall is that strategy, right? How do you put all of this together and do something with it? And then everything follows after that. But those were some top 3, and in those, lots to discuss and think about actually.
Yeah, and just for the Cisco TV team, if we're not already, would you mind showing the first chart, please, just so we've got that in front of us as well? So Wade, at the other end of the scale, which practices are we looking at that perhaps the hardest to implement?
So there's actually 2 things there where we did look at what is hardest to implement. And when you look at that and you just say, which practices show the lowest level of adoption or implementation? You have that well-integrated technology stack is one of the ones that we just said was one of the highest contributors, but also one of the hardest to achieve, according to respondents. Accurate threat detection came out the least implemented of all the practices. And then one that kind of surprised me is meeting vulnerability deadlines was apparently very difficult for organizations as well, even though we've been doing that for a very long time in security. So those are some very difficult ones to implement. And as far as some of the ones that are on the latter end of effectiveness, Wendy mentioned having someone in charge of compliance was very low in terms of all the practices. And one that surprised me, perhaps most of all in this entire study, is that identifying your top cyber risks correlated with none of the outcomes that we measured and was at or near the bottom of the practices we studied. And like I said, that really surprised me because I am generally very pro risk, right? I want to know what my risks are. Therefore, we can order controls accordingly. But I think there's a difference between knowing and doing in this regard, and that might be what we see here.
Yeah. And Wendy, what's your take on that as well? Why do you think those practices might be at the scale, that they are, rather than where we thought they might be?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that when we ask these questions, we didn't say, what are you really bad at? Because we figured nobody's going to, check that box and say, oh, we're really bad at this practice. We said, what are you successful at? What are you struggling with? And so those who said that they were struggling with something didn't necessarily mean that they weren't adopting it. It didn't mean that they were too lazy to do it or they didn't know how. It just meant that they, for their definition of struggling, they were struggling with it. And we've always known that vulnerability remediation is not as easy as it sounds. And, God knows I've gotten on my soapbox a lot about that it's not just a matter of patching. It's not easy. It takes a really long time. And so I'm not surprised to see that at all. And the idea of just identifying risks not being enough in and of itself to correlate with an outcome, that also makes sense because you have to be able to do something about it. Accurate threat detection, I don't feel like anybody would stand up and say, "Oh yeah, we've totally got this nailed." Mike, please contradict me if you feel that anybody has a handle on this. But these are probably the two biggest problems of our industry. And so no matter how sophisticated we get, we're still going to feel like we're struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, how do these reports findings translate into some of the work that Cisco is doing to mitigate some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, internally, we're nothing was surprising here because, frankly, it lines up a lot with kind of how we think about the world internally. I mean, there's a lot of work happening inside Cisco right now to actually do some of the things that we talked about here. So, for example, refreshing a lot of our tech and looking at better integrated tech and aligning to kind of the evolved strategy. So, to give you a clear example, obviously post COVID-19, I haven't been back in the office in I think like 8 months now, which is I had to stop and do the math there for a minute. But it's been close to a year since most of our employees have even seen their desks, right, or connected to the corporate network in the more traditional kind of within our four walls sense. So the strategy then becomes, well, what's the new kind of way in which we can enable what's more or less a permanent state of remote work, and what are the ways in which we can implement controls, frameworks, ways of working that meet the employee base where they're at and acknowledge the fact that there are new ways of working. We are adopting new technologies all the time to enable those new ways of working. So a big pillar of what we're doing right now, frankly, inside Cisco is actually undergoing our own zero trust strategy and rollout. And actually before Thanksgiving, we in the United States, we made the zero trust experience available to a large portion of our workforce for many of the top applications that traditionally have been on-prem, go through VPN to connect to a web app that's in-house. But now that experience is the same as you would for Office 365 or for starting a WebEx. It's as simple as a one-click meeting for people to actually get started with some of those applications. So, it's not a security trade-off, because actually it's easier for our employees to comply and meet the standards and expectations in this case. But it also better acknowledges the realities in which they're working, which is a state of kind of permanent out of the office.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to be talking about the impact on people, and also the impact of COVID-19 on this year as well, because we have some specific questions around that. So we'll cover that in a little bit. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the 2021 Cisco Security Outcomes Study, which you can download for free, totally ungated, cisco.com/go/security outcomes. I want to talk about now the factors that will help you to maximize your success. So Wendy, what are some of your recommendations to companies who are watching this and want to keep their technology up to date, but they don't want to break the bank for obvious reasons? What are your recommendations for that?
Yeah, that was one of my biggest worries when I saw that the top two most correlated practices were proactive tech refresh and integrated tech. And I thought, well, that sounds really nice. And of course, from a conventional wisdom standpoint or a cultural standpoint, we've always felt that newer was better, everything. But how does that help companies with very, very low margins, or agencies in the public sector where good stewardship of taxpayer money requires them to use technology as long as they can, as long as it will function, and only replace it when it breaks down? Because that's more value out of that money for the taxpayers. So if you can't do those things, what can you do instead? And it turns out that there are quite a lot of other things. One of the most interesting that I found, and I wrote a blog post about it that is up on the Cisco website, is that we also mapped these practices against the NIST cybersecurity framework, against the functions that they list: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And we found that protect was the second to last in the number of in the functions that whose practices correlated with successful outcomes, which was kind of weird. That might be a statistical effect, but the one that scored the best in terms of correlation was all the functions that belong to identify, knowing what you have, and being able to detect when that changes. And it sounds really simple when I say it this way, but I know it's not. It is not easy to do an asset inventory and keep it up to date and monitor what you have going forward. That's one of the things that we work on making easier for companies at Cisco, because it is difficult. But for those companies who said that they were prioritizing identify type functions, they showed more correlation with better outcomes. And I think it's because if you work those organizational muscles to understand what you have, be able to control changes to it, change it when you want to, keep it from changing when you don't want to, then those muscles are going to help you respond and recover and detect a lot of other things in your security program. So that's my theory. We're going to be exploring this more in the future with some other industry experts, but that's one thing that I think everybody can work on, even if they can't just replace their technology every time they feel like it.
Yeah. And Wendy's blog is called "Does Protection Help as Much as We Think in Security?" So as Wendy mentioned, that is live and it is an awesome read. Mike, I want to ask you, and if we can maybe get the chart up again, that first chart, that would be great. So a sound security strategy, Mike, that rounds up the top 3 most impactful factors on a general level. What are the key elements for you that go into making a successful security strategy?
Yeah, I think honestly, like what Wendy was saying, a lot of this really does go back to understanding what do we have and what's important to our business and what are we trying to protect. And not just that you as the security leader or practitioner understand that, but you've actually cultivated a shared understanding of those things across many different functions of the business, right? It's not enough for you to sort of unilaterally say, well, I think this thing is important, therefore I'll protect it, but not contemplate the role of that asset or business process in how the company's operating or how it services customers. You really have to go out into the field and kind of work with your partners, make sure they understand your perspective on it, really co-design and co-implement, I think, a strategy, even if the security team has ultimate accountability and ownership over the controls and mitigations that you put in place. I think it's very important for your stakeholders to feel invested, feel heard, feel a part of that decision, make sure they understand what it is that you're trying to do so that they don't feel like you're actually working against the business objectives that they're trying to achieve. A lot of times this is basically changing your mindset from the security team kind of running around being the department of no to figuring out how you become the department of yes, and here's how I'm going to help you get this done safely and securely. And that doesn't mean that you can be everywhere, but again, this is where a thoughtful approach to really understanding what are the priorities of my key business partners? Do I understand the general direction that the business is trying to go? And then how do I support great security outcomes and actually accelerate the ability to make some of those transformations because I have a better understanding of what we're trying to do, rather than dragging everything down with sort of the checklists and the more maybe compliance approach to doing things. I think Wendy kind of touched on this earlier, and I thought it was good. But we talk about, well, if somebody owns compliance, then that's a good thing from a security perspective. Well, actually, I think about it differently, which is a great security program. Compliance will be a natural outcome of that, along with a lot of other good, effective security things that we care about. And I think today more than ever, that starts with just understanding the business and what you're trying to operate and protect, and working in that context.
Yeah, and I love that you use yes and, which is a key improv. That's the foundational improv technique. Saying, agreeing to something and go, hey, yeah, I've got another idea to build on it too. It's
Yes.
It works on so many levels. And Mike, another question for you. It's often said that what makes great leaders is that the way that they respond to a crisis. So what are your recommendations for putting together an effective incident response plan, which is something that we cover in the report as well?
Yeah, honestly, you should plan for failures to occur and really train as you fight in the context of rehearsing those things, learning from them, doing tabletops regularly with your teams, et cetera, and make sure that that incident response process has clear lines of communication to interested stakeholders so that they get the right information at the right time with the right level of accuracy to make decisions. Maybe the most important thing about incident response is, we know that there are always going to be things that we can't anticipate, right? The adversary has to be right one time. We have to be right all the time. So it just speaks to all the more importance of why we need to plan for things to fail or go wrong. But that when those things do happen, that there's a very, very clear, deliberate, and intentional feedback loop back into the security requirements and implementation process, so that you can say, from that thing that happened, we learned the following things, or we learned to look for patterns of potential similar defects in other parts of the enterprise, and go back and deal with those, or accept those risks, or explore mitigations with our partners in other areas of the business, et cetera. If you don't learn from those mistakes, I mean, this is sort of the old adage, right, that you're doomed to repeat them. And I think that retrospective analysis piece of it, independent of whatever your incident response playbook looks like, is critical to making sure that you're actually driving continuous improvement all the time.
Brilliant. I want to talk about meeting security objectives whilst managing costs. So building on what Wendy was saying earlier about cost-effective security. Wade, could you talk about the success factors for running a cost-effective security program? I know that you also have a Goldilocks analogy for security budgets. So I naturally assume that it's got something to do with which chair to sit in and how to get your porridge just right. But I don't know, I might be wrong.
You got it. Yeah, and so just real quick on the chart that I think everybody is looking at there, that is overall program success. And again, the way you read these measures is when we looked at all of the results, having a strong proactive tech refresh strategy upped the probability of success, overall program level success, by an average of 12.7%. There's a little range there from about 10.5 to 14.5, showing that there's some uncertainty and there's a distribution underlying that, but on average by 12.7%. And so we did this overall, like you're seeing here, but for every outcome, of which one of them is running a cost-effective program, is one of the outcomes we measured. You'll see a chart exactly like this. So this is why one of the things I love about this report, let's just say that running a cost-effective program is where you're really, really struggling, right? You feel the need to minimize cost and yet still be effective, flip to that outcome. And what you'll see there is some things that are similar. You do see the well-integrated tech, you do see the proactive tech refresh strategy. But you see some things like, security awareness training added in there, having a sufficient but not ridiculously large security budget is a critical success factor for running a cost-effective program. Incident response, disaster recovery, vulnerability remediation deadlines. I view those almost as the basic blocking and tackling of a security program. We know we can't prevent everything, so we need to be able to effectively deal with something in a timely manner when it happens, whether that's an investigation in say an intrusion scenario, or failing over very quickly to maintain resilience in some type of business continuity context. Those types of things are popping there. And overall, one of the things I see across this entire study is it's not just one thing. If you just look at those numbers, I mean, this is not the one for cost-effective program, but if you just look at those numbers, all the charts are kind of similar. In other words, there's not one thing you can do and you increase your chance of success by 90%, right? It's the combination of a bunch of little things done well or better than average that kind of build a successful program. And also, there's some color coding of all the practices here. And we have 3 categories: architecture and operations, business and governments, and strategy and spending. And in many of these, it's not just one thing. It's not all about architecture and operations, although that one was featured a lot in all of these. It's really across the board. And I think that aligns with what we teach, at least, about building a good security program. It's it's everything and everybody. It's not just one thing or one person. But you really do see that reflected in the data. And it was gratifying to see to learn that from the data, rather than just kind of making it up ourselves, or it just being a reflection of, I think these things work well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the report, we've categorized all of these findings into things like enabling the business, managing risk, and operating efficiently. So hopefully it's all laid out nice and clear for you. It is, if I haven't said it yet, it's a great report. And you can download it at cisco.com/go/security outcomes. Wendy, I'd like to ask you about the fact that the report demonstrates that when it comes to trying to avoid cyber attacks, we shouldn't just be studying, the big public incidents for, trying to find clues on how to avoid them ourselves, but we should also look to our own incidents and our own near misses. Can you talk about why that might be and how companies can do that?
Well, some of the best companies that I have worked with and talked to in terms of incident detection and response, um, as has been said before, they work on it continually. And one of the things that they try to do is they try to automate whatever they feel that they can make repeatable, consistent, precise, tightly scoped, and that they can set and forget. So anytime they either hear of an incident externally or experience one, they look at how could we have detected this, or how did we detect it? What's the best way we can detect this? And now that we know how to do that, can we automate that so that we don't have to rely on humans to do it anymore? Can we build it into our portfolio detection? So it's not one big, massive automated thing that is going to magically find everything. They take what they have known how to do and what they can now standardize, they automate it, and then they move on and they keep working on continuous improvement. So that's the sort of thing that um, I think works really well when you look at your own capabilities, not just what you read in the headlines, but what your particular circumstances are, what your constraints are, what your culture is, what talents you have in house, what resources are available to you, and then construct in little bits and pieces the things that work really well for you.
Excellent, thank you. And Wade, I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organizations and their security, because we asked specific questions about this in the survey. So could you provide an overview of the responses to this question?
Sure. So what we did here was, again, normally we had practices and outcomes, but we went off script a little bit and asked specifically about COVID-19 as separate from those 11 outcomes. And the question was basically, how did this impact your IT and security operations? You know, did everything just crumble down, or did you shove on through fairly unscathed? And those that did well, that had minimal impact to operations, had three characteristics that we noticed from their responses. First, they took this proactive tech refresh strategy. I know we keep saying it over and over again, but when you read the report, you're going to see that almost everywhere. And because of that, I do think we need to recognize that, hey, this must be fundamentally important, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, if you can imagine a situation where you're trying to cut over to a remote workforce and you have two scenarios. Is that going to be easier to do with a huge amount of technical debt and legacy systems? Or is that going to be easier to do for a more modern SaaS-based infrastructure where you can make changes like that when you have to? I think pretty much everybody kind of would agree that, oh, the latter sounds better. So I think I get it. But beyond that, the next two were not technical at all. Number two was adequate security staffing levels. And again, I'm not sure this is going to surprise anyone, but having good people and good role-based training programs both popped as a way to navigate COVID-19 successfully. And again, that kind of makes sense. Hey, we need to make a bunch of fundamental changes to the way we architect and operate IT and security. If you've got good people, that's going to be easier. And then number three on that list was clear reporting to executives. Now that one kind of seems to come in from left field somewhere and maybe not expected. But I think what's going on there is, again, this is a survey, so there's some perception rolled into this. But when there is a crisis, communication becomes absolutely critical. And if you think of a scenario where communication with executives and company leadership is horrible from the IT and security teams, the impact to that is just going to be a disaster, whether that's perceived or reality, right? And if the lines of communication are open and running smoothly and done well, it just helps everybody be on the same page and navigate that crisis. And those are the top three. And you know, when you start to diagnose them, I think they make a lot of sense.
Excellent, thank you. I wanted to make sure that we had some time to focus on the impact of people. We do have a big section on this in the report. And Mike, I know this, the subject of people is very, very close to your heart. You've talked to me before about having, a strong security culture and how that impacts everything. Just to give people an overview, so the data says that giving people good technology that meets their needs, a clear sense of direction, and timely fixes when things break or keep them from breaking, those have the most impact. Can you talk about security culture and some of the initiatives that you've invoked to build a strong people-powered security culture, which is a reference for Masha Sadova, who he may well be listening, one of our favorite people.
Yeah, no, it's great. For a long time, Hazel, as you know, there was a way of thinking out there that was people are your weakest link in security, and I fundamentally reject that thesis completely as incompatible with kind of the world that we live in today. And really, how I think about it is people are your best defense, and your job as a security leader and practitioner is to make it easy to comply with the things that you need them to comply with, and to give them the right amount of enablement. And this, by the way, varies by company, industry, expectations, et cetera. So your mileage may vary, but give them the right amount of enablement so that they reliably know when to ask for help, you can meet that request when it comes in, and that they can raise their hand when they see something that's funny. And as a leader, when you're promoting a security culture in an organization, you don't want it to be the, oh no, if I go to the security team, it's going to be a bad time. You want it to be I can go to them when I see something that's not right, so that they can help me deal with it, or help the right team deal with it, or get the right people to respond to it. And as Wendy will remember, when I was part of Duo, every month when we had the company all hands, anytime I got up on stage for whatever the reason was, the first thing I did every time was I said, raise your hand if you're on the security team. And the goal, of course, was to get everybody to raise their hand. And really underneath that is there's this desire to make sure that people have agency and they feel like they have some amount of ownership over security of the company and your customers. And they really have internalized that as on a day-to-day basis. No matter what my job function is, if I'm working in accounts receivable, if I'm a software engineer, if I'm a lawyer, that the way I handle information, flag concerns, ask questions has a meaningful impact on the security and opportunity of the company. And certainly, again, based on role or function, that can be a small impact, that can be a big impact. It doesn't matter, but you really want people to feel like they have a role in that. And it's definitely not to make everybody a security expert. That's intractable. And it's not, we want people to be experts at the things that we hired them for at the company. But we want them to feel involved in the system, and the system is working with and for them and the greater good of the company. So really just making sure it's that kind of inclusive approach to thinking about security, not security in the ivory tower, is a great way to leverage that human sensor network that exists in the company, because that really, at the end of the day, is your best visibility and your best control.
Fantastic. And I apologize if there's any loud bangs coming from my end. One of my neighbors is throwing a fireworks party, so I'm not sure why, but so apologies for that. But Mike, we also discussed how diversity is so important, both in people's backgrounds, in their skills, their opinions. They're all essential, and it's about creating a culture where your people feel included, respected, and are able to really grow their careers. And you've talked to me about this subject on the Security Stories podcast, so I know how passionately you feel about this. How do you recruit diverse talent into your team, and what has been the impact of that?
Yeah, like we talked about in our conversation, Hazel, I think if you want non-traditional and exceptional results, have non-traditional and exceptional recruiting practices and hiring practices. And like we discussed, I have middle school teachers who have been on my teams. I have artists, designers, people with liberal arts backgrounds. My undergrad was in economics, so I'm kind of a math and stats person before I got into security. This diverse range of experiences, thoughts, and perspectives is actually what allows you to take a more holistic view of how people work with and experience technology, security, and business practices. If you have this monotheistic security culture, you're only going to see things through a lens that's frankly like too homogenous to sort of think outside the box about like what are the right way to meet people where they're at. And the reality is, across the rest of your business, you have people with tremendously diverse backgrounds and sets of experiences, educations, cultural perspectives, and you need to model some of that within your team. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't hire people who have security engineering backgrounds or security policy expertise. You absolutely should, but you should very much seek out to find people with some of the other complementary different experiences and perspectives that can really give you a well-rounded approach, and also really help you as a leader make sure that you're being challenged and that you are not overly driving or indexing on your own backgrounds and experiences. So creating that constructive dialogue, and what if we tried this? What if we did that? At my last company, we did this, can really lead to some net new and novel ideas that you wouldn't otherwise get if you had a more a team that was engaged too much in sort of a groupthink.
Brilliant. Now, I have two of my questions left, but we do have some time for audience questions. So please do start thinking of those and getting those in. If you're watching us on cisco.com, there is a Q&A panel that you can use. If you're watching us on Facebook or LinkedIn, pop your question in the comments, or on Twitter, use the hashtag #SecurityOutcomes. Wendy, let's talk automation. So this is about trying to counteract, some operational dead ends, some bottlenecks, and hopefully this has an effect on easing burnout as well. Now, the report suggests that automation does indeed help with all of that. So do you have any recommendations on how companies can best move towards having a more automated security environment?
Yeah, automation is really hot, and it would be great if we could just, set everything running and set it and forget it. But of course, it's not that easy. My personal hypothesis on this is that automation, when it's done right, goes best with certainty, precision, commitment, and transparency. So certainty, you have to be sure that whatever you're automating, whatever actions you're doing, you have to make sure you really want them to happen, like all the time, consistently. Um, and you want precision in that you want this automation to affect only the parts that you determine. You don't want it to affect things in a cascading motion or something out of scope that you didn't think about. You want to make sure that you're doing exactly what you want with that automation and only that. You need commitment. You need to be able to leave it and not have to come back to it and tweak it all the time, because otherwise that's not really automated. And you need transparency, which means that anybody who encounters this automation needs to know what it's going to do. They need to understand what inputs it takes, what outputs they should expect, how it works, no black boxes. And that's a philosophy that we work with in Cisco. There should be no black boxes. We should explain to you what's going to happen and why, so that you can decide whether you trust it. So using those principles can help you be successful with automation in the areas where that's going to fit best.
Excellent, thank you. And if we could show that second chart, please. Awesome.
Here's the big one. I'm so excited
Here
about
it is.
this one.
And this is actually interactive on the cisco.com/go/security outcomes page, so you can really play about with it at your leisure. So Wade, this last chart is basically a roadmap for success. We call it the ultimate choose your own security adventure. Can you explain this chart, how people can use it? And every security leader is different, every company is different. So this is all about us providing some information and applying it to their own environments and use cases. So could you maybe talk about how they can do that?
Absolutely. So this chart encapsulates literally every other chart in the report. You've got your 25 different common security practices along the bottom there that we inquired about, and the 11 security program outcomes along the vertical axis, excuse me. And where you see a colored cell at the intersection means there was a statistically significant correlation between that practice and that outcome. So what we mean by a choose your own adventure, actually, let me back up. Before you even start comparing practices and outcomes and choosing your own adventure, just look at the pattern here. If I recall correctly, 55% of that matrix, if you take 25 practices and 11 outcomes, there's 275 squares in that matrix, 55% of which are blank, meaning there's no correlation between that practice and outcome. 45% have some significant contribution to success. If you just think about that for a minute and you think, I wonder if over half of the things that I think are working effectively in security and accomplishing some goal are actually not. I really want to know which those are and which are the ones that work. So it's I think that's an interesting thing. And by the way, that matrix changes based on region, based on industry, and we'll share some of that as this report goes on at the same location here. So back to the choose your own adventure. What we mean is if you want to accomplish keeping up with the business, you want a security program that's able to do that. That first outcome, just scan across horizontally and look at the practices where that blue color pops, where it's dark blue, that's going to be the strongest correlation, and just follow the practices and pick those out. If you look at that, there's about a dozen practices that, based on this analysis, significantly increase the likelihood of success for programs wanting to keep up with the business. Maybe you want to manage top risks. Maybe you want to run a cost-effective program. Maybe you want to retain top security talent. Works the same way, right? Find your objective of choice, scan across, find practices that the analysis shows contributes to that outcome. But that's not all. You can also read this vertically. In other words, maybe you're interested not so much in achieving an outcome, but maybe someone has come to you and said, hey, I want to invest in this new thing, security practice. Well, if you can find that across the bottom there, and then scan up, you'll see where you are most likely to see benefit from implementing that practice. And this might be a way to justify spending. It might be a way to evaluate or ask some hard questions about spending. You know, you're telling me we're going to achieve this by investing in this practice, but I don't see any evidence of that. What's going on here? Let's talk about this more. And the whole point of this is to help security leaders choose their own adventure and have these kinds of discussions. And I think for the first time, we can have a very widespread conversation about practices from a data-driven perspective and see what contributes, why and where and how. And I hope I genuinely hope it helps level up the conversation that we typically have in those kind of meetings where people all kind of say, hey, I think this is a great thing to do. Let's do that. I don't know why. And you've all been there. So hoping this leads to a better conversation.
Now, I want to go back and emphasize again, when you look at things like identifying your top cyber risks and people saying, well, this shows no correlation. What do you mean we shouldn't be doing that? Again, we're not saying that. We're saying that by itself alone, it does not show any correlation. But if you, or naming somebody in charge of compliance, we're not saying you shouldn't name somebody in charge of compliance. We're just saying that by itself, it's not enough. So if you want to go to meeting compliance regulations, which is MR2, kind of in the middle of this, you look across and you see there are a lot of other cells that are filled in, which means you should be doing those other things too. That those are the things that are going to help you get there, not just the one that doesn't show any correlation by itself.
Yeah, you know, Wendy, I'd build on that too by just adding what you were describing to me is the embodiment of the comment around having an effective security strategy, right? Like these are things you do because they collectively lead to meaningful business security outcomes, right? And I think at times, and this can be easy because of sort of the way we have things in the security industry as a whole, is there's a lot of stuff you can do and things you can buy and shiny objects that you can hold up. But you know, there's a line there between kind of, we have security activities and we are driving meaningful security business results. And, you know, I think that's important to always keep in mind, kind of focusing on the latter thing, and the activities, while they might in and of themselves be interesting or cool or tell a good narrative, having to make sure that you're doing the right things and that they meaningfully tie back to like what your top level security strategy and objectives are for the business is the really cool thing. And in many cases will mean saying no to some of the activities that don't directly contribute to that.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, I hope somebody's already put this in a question box, but if they haven't, I will say, does correlation equal causation? No, it does not. And we all know this. We're showing what we see statistically appears to be a correlation, but it actually could be the other way around. It could be that organizations that report, gaining executive confidence are able to do some of these other practices because they have the confidence, not that doing those practices got them there to get that confidence, if that makes sense. So there are a lot of different ways to contemplate this, which is why, again, I think this is worth reading over and over again, or just sitting there on our Cisco website and clicking on these things and playing with them to see what other types of ideas you can get from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a conversation starter and a half. So we're going to go over to some live questions now. First, I actually want to read it's not a question, it's more of a comment. And it was something that you said, Mike, about the importance and relevance of hiring diverse talents. And Taylor has said, my best InfoSec hires over the years have come from non-STEM backgrounds, so philosophy, history, political science. So that's awesome. And if anyone wants to, read more about, people's backgrounds and how they came into security, we published an ebook just over a month ago now. It's called Diversity in Cybersecurity, a Mosaic of Career Possibilities. So if you want to check that out for some more inspiration, please do so. Let's see. Wade, I think I'm going to throw this one your way. It's a bit deep. Osama asks on Twitter, does the survey answer what really works in security or what people think worked for them in security? So does it measure actual outcomes or perception?
I will say in the middle, and that's not an attempt to dodge, but it was a perceptive question. So kudos to whoever asked that. So let me see if I can kind of summarize where I think this falls. So are we actually measuring what works in security? Admittedly, we're not. One day, I hope to take several hundred organizations and monitor all their spending habits and all of their incidents and all of their practices and really actually measure which things lead to which outcomes. And we did not do that here. But we also did not simply ask, hey, what do you think works in security? What worked for you? Share your feelings. We did not do that. We asked the 4,800 respondents in the survey, how are you doing along those practices that are along the bottom of that last chart that you saw? And then completely separate questions, are you seeing success in these outcomes? Not once did we say, does this practice lead to or correlate with this outcome? So in that sense, we did actually measure which practices correlate with which outcomes, as long as you do have the caveat of, yes, it is subject to their perception of whether they're doing that practice well and their perception of whether they are succeeding in that outcome. And I'm sure there's some variation there, right? It's a survey, and we need to recognize that. But I also think that people are fairly well, if they're being honest, can at least know, hey, is my security program cost effective? Oof, I don't think so. We blow a lot of money. Or, conversely, yeah, I think we're doing a pretty good job there. So in that sense, we are actually measuring the correlation. We're not completely dependent on what people think works in security. I hopefully that clears something up there.
Yeah, that's great. And Wendy, you touched on this, but we've had a specific question about this, and I think it's worth repeating. So Ben has asked, something like a 3% average increase in probability of success sounds like quite a small percentage. Should somebody ignore anything below a certain percentage?
I don't think so. And Wade and I have talked about this before as well, that actually I would be really surprised if we saw a big number in there that, this will raise your success by 80%. That sounds like a silver bullet to me. And I don't think anyone would believe it if we said it. So these numbers are actually, for this inaugural study, and for the types of statistical analysis that we did, and of course the perception effect that Wade talks about in here, for all of these things, these numbers appear to make a lot more sense. And that, it's not just one thing. So if you are looking across a row and picking 5 or 6 practices that you want to get better at, they're going to raise your they probably will raise the percentage of likelihood of your success by more than just one individual number. Now, as a non-data scientist, Wade, how did I do on that answer?
I thought you did very well. That's right. I think sometimes we're a little bit too optimistic on, if I only did this, everything would change and we'd go from bad security program to great overnight. And it's just not that case. These are all building blocks. It's incremental. And the goal here is to do a multitude of things that have good evidence that they actually work. And if we put that together, chances are we're going to be more successful than other programs. But there's no guarantee of success.
Great. I've had a few more questions, so we might go a couple of minutes over. I hope that's okay with everybody. Actually, Wendy, stay there because I've got another one for you. Steve asks, your integrated cyber capabilities is key to a successful outcome. Sounds a lot like a zero trust approach. Was this construct addressed in the report? Was zero trust addressed in the report?
Well, zero trust was addressed separately in the report. And yes, that the idea of integrated technology was asked very broadly and on purpose because it could mean a lot of things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the principles of zero trust, which are basically don't trust anything just because it got through your firewall or just because it's inside. But we do have a section in the report where we talk about we did ask respondents, are you all into zero trust, or are you working on it, or are you not doing it at all? And so what's really interesting is that the ones who said that they were all in on zero trust showed a higher correlation with successful program outcomes. And the ones who said, nah, we're not doing zero trust also showed a pretty high correlation with successful outcomes. And just the ones in the middle who said, yeah, we're kind of trying it, reported less statistically. And I'm still trying to figure that out. And it may be just because they're not where they want to be yet. So they don't feel successful, independently at those outcomes. I don't know. I think it would be a good area to dig in more deeply.
Excellent. And last question is specifically for Mike. So Natalie asks, Mike, what is your top advice for security executives for the next year?
My top advice for security executives for the next year is to just get to know your business better. It's not possible for any of us to know everything there is to know about security. That's why we hire teams, people who have specialized experiences in particular backgrounds or experiences outside of security that complement how the team works. But your effectiveness of that team and how you deploy your strategy is going to be limited by your understanding and sort of mastery of the business around you, right? So there's no one CISO role or security leader role that's got an identical sort of pattern for how you run those plays to implement it in a business. So best thing to do is just get to know the business around you, and maybe more importantly, get to know where the business is going. Kind of here in Michigan, we'll say, you want to skate to where the puck is going. And that's really important, I think, to understand, like, where are you going and how do you make sure the security strategy meets the business where it needs to be.
Excellent, thank you. I love a good hockey analogy. That is unfortunately all we've got time for today. My thanks to Wendy, to Wade and Mike for all of your insights. A wonderful conversation. I've really, really enjoyed it. And my thanks especially to our audience for watching as well. So if you missed anything, the replay of this event will be live in the next 24 to 48 hours on this very page, which is cisco.com/go/security summit. And to get your very own copy of the 2021 Security Outcomes Study, it's there, it's on the screen, cisco.com/go/security outcomes. It is a thing of beauty. And as I mentioned, there's that interactive version of the Choose Your Own Adventure chart on that webpage as well. So with that, I will say goodbye for now. Here's looking forward to a great 2021. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.
Fully virtualized,
cloud,
core,
transport,
virtual RAN,
everything. It will be the first of its kind.
Oh yeah,
You can figure it out.
we can figure it out.
This is their idea. It's an ambitious idea, an unprecedented idea.
It's true.
But this is what industry executives called it.
Impossible.
But that didn't stop them. That just made them hungry.
So Prakash, how about developers?
We'll create a platform.
Different systems.
Different partners
Working together.
What else?
This is the plane that took the Rakuten team to San Jose.
Okay, so it takes 3 weeks to implement a traditional radio site.
With automation, we can do it in 10 minutes. And more secure,
Zero touch,
zero defect.
ready for 5G.
Just upgrade the software.
This is Tarek's impressed face.